They told you you're one in a million. It sounded like a compliment, but over time it started to feel like a cage because when you're told you're one in a million, what they're really saying is you're rare, but replaceable, special, but not necessary, important, but only statistically. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to shrink. You stop believing your struggle matters. You stop believing your voice carries weight. You stop believing that you can change anything. Tonight, this is not about being one in a million. This is about understanding why that idea was never meant to define you, because you were never designed to be a number in someone else's comparison. You were designed to be irreplaceable. This is about standing up from quiet doubt, breaking free from small labels, and remembering that your value was never based on how rare you are, but on the fact that there has never been and will never be another you. They say you're one in a million, and the first time you hear it, it feels warm. It feels like recognition, like someone finally saw something in you that stood out in a crowded world. You carry it with you for a while. You repeat it silently when you're tired. You let it sit beside you when you're unsure. It sounds like encouragement, like validation, like hope. But over time, something strange happens. The words don't grow with you. They stay small, fixed, frozen in the moment they were said. And while you keep moving forward, those words begin to pull you backward in ways you don't notice right away. Because one in a million sounds rare, but it also sounds distant. It sounds like a number instead of a life. It sounds like you're special, but only statistically. Like you're valuable, but only when measured against others. And slowly, without intention, the meaning shifts. You stop hearing possibility, and you start hearing pressure. You start hearing expectations you didn't agree to. You start hearing a quiet demand to prove it again and again, to earn the right to keep those words attached to your name. At first, you try harder than before. You push yourself further than you planned. You stay quiet when you're tired because you don't want to disappoint the idea people have of you. You don't want to fall from that invisible pedestal. You don't want to be the person who couldn't live up to the compliments, so you smile more than you feel. You nod when you're unsure. You carry weight that was never meant to be yours. And the strange part is, no one asked you to do this. The words did it on their own. Being told you're one in a million slowly teaches you that being ordinary is dangerous, that rest is weakness, that struggle is failure, that doubt means you're losing whatever made you special in the first place. So you hide those parts. You hide the days when you don't feel strong. You hide the moments when you don't know what you're doing. You hide the fact that you're human because humans are messy, and one in a million sounds clean, polished, finished, but you were never finished. You were never meant to be. What they didn't tell you is that being one in a million still puts you inside a crowd. It still means comparison. It still means ranking. It still means someone is counting. And when someone is counting, they're also replacing. Because if you're one in a million, that means there are others, maybe not exactly like you, but close enough for the world to move on without slowing down if you stumble. And that realization hits quietly, usually late at night, when you're alone with your thoughts and the noise finally stops. You start to wonder what happens if you fail, what happens if you change, what happens if you no longer fit the version of you that earned those words. Will they still see you? Will they still care? Will you still matter? And that's when the compliment becomes a cage, a beautiful one, a polished one, but a cage all the same. Because now you're not living for growth, you're living for preservation. You're not becoming, you're maintaining. You're not exploring, you're defending an image. And the more you defend it, the further you drift from yourself. You stop asking what you want. You stop listening to your instincts. You stop trusting your own timing. You measure your life against expectations that were never yours to begin with. The world loves labels because labels are easy. They save time. They simplify complexity. They turn people into summaries. And one in a million is one of the most seductive labels of all. It feels generous. It feels kind, but it removes depth. It removes context. It removes the long nights, the quiet fears, the failures that taught you more than success ever did. It removes the process. And you are not the result. You are the process. You weren't shaped by rarity. You were shaped by experience, by pain that forced you to grow, by love that taught you how to stay, by loss that changed the way you see the world, by moments when no one was watching and you still chose to keep going. None of that fits into a number. None of that can be counted. None of that can be compared. And yet, comparison creeps in anyway. You look around and start measuring your pace against others. You wonder why they're ahead. You wonder why they seem lighter. You wonder why their lives look easier from the outside. And because you've been told you're one in a million, you feel like you're not allowed to fall behind. You feel like you're not allowed to ask for help. You feel like you're not allowed to be lost, because lost doesn't look special. Lost looks ordinary, and ordinary feels like failure when you've been taught to be exceptional. But here's the truth that doesn't get spoken enough. Ordinary moments are where real strength is built. In the days where nothing remarkable happens. In the routines you show up for anyway. In the conversations that don't change the world but change you. In the slow progress that doesn't impress anyone but keeps you alive inside. That's where resilience lives. Not in being one in a million, but in being one person who refuses to give up on themselves. The pressure to be rare disconnects you from being real. It teaches you to perform instead of exist, to achieve instead of feel, to impress instead of understand. And when life inevitably humbles you, when something breaks, when something ends, when something doesn't work out no matter how hard you try, the fall feels heavier because you weren't prepared to fail. You were prepared to stand out, not to fall down. And falling down is part of being alive. No one tells you that the most dangerous thing about being called special is that it can stop you from learning, because learning requires humility. It requires admitting you don't know. It requires starting over. And starting over feels like erasing what made you one in a million in the first place. So you resist it. You cling to what you know even when it no longer fits. You stay in places that shrink you because leaving would mean change, and change feels like risk. But staying still is its own kind of loss. You don't need to be rare to be meaningful. You don't need to be exceptional to be necessary. You don't need to stand above others to stand firmly within yourself. The value of your life was never about how few people are like you. It was about how deeply you live, how honestly you show up, how courageously you face your own reflection when no one else is around. The world doesn't move forward because of numbers. It moves forward because of individuals who choose integrity over image, consistency over applause, growth over comfort, people who are willing to be misunderstood while they're becoming, people who are willing to let go of labels that no longer serve them, people who understand that worth isn't something you prove, it's something you practice by the way you treat yourself and others. You were never meant to carry the weight of being one in a million. You were meant to carry the responsibility of being yourself, fully, honestly, imperfectly. And that responsibility is heavier in a different way because it doesn't come with applause, it comes with quiet choices. Daily choices, choices no one claps for, choices that don't trend, choices that don't get noticed until much later, if at all. But those choices build something real. You don't owe the world your uniqueness. You don't owe anyone a performance. You don't owe anyone the version of you that made them comfortable. What you owe yourself is truth, space, patience, permission to change without apology, permission to rest without guilt, permission to fail without shame. Being one in a million suggests scarcity, but your life was never scarce. It's expansive, it's layered, it's still unfolding. And the moment you stop trying to be rare is the moment you start being free, free to grow at your own pace, free to redefine success, free to walk away from comparisons that were never fair to begin with. You don't disappear when you stop being special. You appear in your own life. You appear in your own decisions. You appear in moments where you're no longer trying to impress anyone, including yourself. And in that space, something stronger than praise begins to form, something quieter, something more stable, a sense of self that isn't shaken by opinions or numbers or expectations. The world will keep counting. It always does. It will rank, label, categorize, and compare. That's how systems work. But you don't have to live like a system. You get to live like a human being, complex, contradictory, growing, learning, starting again when necessary. You don't need to be one in a million to matter. You need to be one in your own life, present, honest, awake. And when you finally let go of the need to be rare, you make room for something better, something deep, or something that doesn't fade when circumstances change or when praise disappears or when life takes an unexpected turn, because numbers don't hold you together when things fall apart. Identity does. And identity isn't given to you by compliments. It's built in silence, in effort, in resilience, in the moments when no one is reminding you that you're special and you still choose to move forward anyway, still choose kindness, still choose growth, still choose to believe that life has value even when it looks ordinary, especially when it looks ordinary, because that's where most of life actually happens, in the quiet, in-between spaces where no one is watching and no one is counting and no one is measuring, where you sit with yourself and realize that you were never meant to be one in a million. You were meant to be one whole person, living a life that is yours, learning to stand without needing permission, learning to breathe without being praised, learning to walk without being compared, learning to exist without needing a label to justify your place in the world, learning that freedom doesn't come from being rare. It comes from being real, and real is something no number has ever been able to define or contain or replace or measure or reduce into something small enough to control. Because the moment you stop trying to fit inside a compliment is the moment you begin to understand that your life was never meant to be summarized. It was meant to be lived moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath, even when it's messy, even when it's slow, even when it doesn't look impressive, because meaning isn't loud and value isn't flashy and growth isn't always visible. And the most important parts of who you are forming right now in ways you won't fully understand until much later, when you look back and realize that letting go of being one in a million was the first step toward becoming someone who no longer needed to be counted at all. Being praised without being understood is one of the quietest forms of loneliness. It doesn't feel painful at first. In fact, it feels like safety, like acceptance, like you've finally done something right. People clap for the surface, smile at the result, admire the outcome. They tell you how strong you are, how impressive you've become, how lucky the world is to have you. And you learn how to receive it. You learn where to stand, how to nod, how to say thank you without revealing too much. You learn how to let the praise land without letting the truth rise with it, because the truth is heavier. The truth is that they don't see the nights when you doubted yourself. They don't see the parts of you that hesitated. They don't see the moments when you almost stopped. They don't see the fear that sat beside you while you kept moving forward anyway. And when people praise you without understanding you, they aren't praising you. They're praising an idea of you, a version that feels safe to admire because it doesn't ask anything uncomfortable from them. Understanding requires presence. Praise does not. Understanding means sitting with someone in their uncertainty. Praise only shows up after the uncertainty is gone. Understanding listens. Praise talks. Understanding asks questions. Praise gives statements. And when your life becomes surrounded by praise instead of understanding, you start to feel unseen in a way that's difficult to explain. Because from the outside, it looks like you have everything: support, recognition, respect. But on the inside, there's a quiet separation forming between who you are and who people think you are. That separation grows slowly. You start editing yourself without realizing it. You share less of what confuses you. You hide the parts that don't match the story people are celebrating. You stop talking about your doubts because they don't fit the image. You stop asking for help because you don't want to interrupt the applause. And eventually you stop checking in with yourself because you're too busy maintaining the version of you that others have already accepted. Being misunderstood isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like compliments. When people praise you without understanding you, they place expectations on you that you never agreed to. They assume consistency where there is growth. They assume confidence where there is courage. They assume ease where there was endurance. And once those assumptions settle in, you feel pressure to stay the same, not because you want to, but because changing feels like letting them down. It feels like betraying the image they're attached to. So you carry it, you carry the weight of being admired while feeling unknown. You carry the responsibility of living up to words that were never meant to define you. And over time, that weight becomes exhausting because you're not allowed to be tired. You're not allowed to be uncertain. You're not allowed to be human in ways that don't look inspiring. Praise without understanding turns your life into a performance. You begin to notice that people only show up when you're strong. They only listen when you're confident. They only care when your story has a positive angle. And when you struggle, when you slow down, when you fall quiet, the room empties in subtle ways, not dramatically, not cruelly, just enough for you to notice, just enough for you to learn that your value in their eyes is conditional. That lesson sinks deep. It teaches you to survive by being impressive instead of honest. It teaches you to package your pain into lessons instead of letting it be pain. It teaches you to skip grief and jump straight to growth because that's the part people like to hear. And while growth is important, skipping grief doesn't make it disappear. It just buries it deeper, where it has more power over you later. You can be praised by thousands and still feel alone if no one knows who you really are. Understanding requires vulnerability from both sides. It requires someone to stay when the story gets uncomfortable, when the answers aren't clear, when the ending hasn't arrived yet. Praise doesn't wait for that. Praise shows up when things are already resolved, already shaped into something easy to digest. And when your life becomes surrounded by people who only know how to praise you, you start to feel like you can't invite them into the unfinished parts of yourself. So you keep those parts hidden. You tell yourself you'll deal with them later, when things slow down, when expectations ease, when you have time. But time doesn't soften what's ignored, it hardens it. And eventually, the gap between who you are and who you present becomes wide enough that you feel disconnected from your own life. You wake up one day and realize that people know your achievements, but not your reasons, your strength, but not your fear, your success, but not your cost. And the hardest part is that you helped build this distance, not because you wanted to deceive anyone, but because you wanted to belong. Because being praised felt safer than being questioned. Because being admired felt easier than being understood. Because understanding requires risk, and risk feels dangerous when you've already been accepted for something else. The danger of praise without understanding is that it can make you feel replaceable. Because if people only see the result, then anyone who achieves a similar result could take your place. They don't see your uniqueness in the process, in the way you think, in the way you struggle, in the way you care. They only see what you produce, and production can always be matched, replicated, surpassed. Understanding cannot. Understanding sees the context, it sees the journey, it sees the human behind the outcome. And when you are understood, you don't feel pressure to maintain an image. You feel permission to evolve, to fail, to rest, to change direction, I don't know without fear of losing your place, but praise often doesn't allow that space. It freezes you in time. It captures a moment and asks you to live inside it forever. Be this strong, be this confident, be this successful, be this inspiring. And when you're not, when you can't be, when life shifts as it always does, you feel guilt for disappointing people who never truly knew you in the first place. That guilt is heavy because it's undeserved. You didn't promise to stay the same. You didn't sign an agreement to always be okay. You didn't choose to be admired at the cost of being understood. You just did your best with what you had at the time. And that best deserves compassion, not expectation. Real connection doesn't come from praise. It comes from presence, from someone seeing you when you're unsure and staying anyway, from someone listening without trying to turn your pain into motivation, from someone allowing your story to be unfinished without rushing you toward a conclusion. When praise replaces understanding, relationships become shallow without anyone noticing. Conversations stay on the surface. Emotions get simplified. Struggles get minimized. And you start to feel like there's no place to put the parts of you that don't fit the narrative. So you internalize them. You tell yourself to be grateful. You tell yourself others have it worse. You tell yourself you shouldn't complain. And while gratitude is important, silence can become a prison when it's built on fear of disappointing others. You deserve to be understood, not just admired. You deserve to be known, not just applauded. Understanding doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it challenges the way people see you. Sometimes it requires difficult conversations. But it's honest. And honesty is what allows you to breathe fully in your own life. When you are only praised, you hold your breath. You wait for the next expectation, the next standard, the next moment you have to live up to something. And living like that slowly disconnects you from your own needs. You stop asking yourself how you're doing. You stop noticing when you're overwhelmed. You stop honoring your limits. Because limits don't look impressive, limits don't earn praise, but limits are human. And being human is not a flaw, it's the foundation. Without it, everything else collapses eventually. No one can live forever as an idea. Sooner or later, reality asks for your presence. It asks you to be honest about what you can carry and what you can't. It asks you to choose between being admired and being real. That choice isn't obvious at first, because admiration feels like love. But love stays when admiration fades. Love wants to know you, not just celebrate you. Love makes room for your contradictions, your doubts, your quiet moments, your unfinished thoughts. You don't need more praise. You need more understanding from others, yes, but also from yourself. You need to allow yourself to be complex without apology, to be in progress without shame, to be unsure without feeling like you're failing some invisible test. The more you seek understanding, the less trapped you feel by praise. The more you allow yourself to be known, the less pressure you feel to perform. And slowly, the distance between who you are and who you present begins to close. You stop living for approval and start living for alignment. You stop trying to protect an image and start protecting your peace. You stop asking whether people are impressed and start asking whether you're being honest. And in that shift, something changes quietly but permanently. You feel lighter, more grounded, more present, because you're no longer carrying the weight of being admired without being known. You're carrying yourself as you are in real time without needing to translate your life into something palatable for others. Understanding doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being present. And the moment you allow yourself to step out of the role and into your reality, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were lost to expectations, to praise, to silent pressure, to the need to be impressive instead of authentic, to the fear that being honest would cost you your place, when in truth, the only thing it ever cost you was connection to others and connection to yourself. And rebuilding that connection doesn't require applause. It requires courage. The courage to be seen in your uncertain. Thank you. The courage to speak without packaging. The courage to exist without constantly proving your worth. Because worth doesn't come from being praised. It comes from being understood. And understanding starts the moment you stop hiding the parts of you that don't shine and realize they were never meant to be hidden in the first place. Comparison doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It slips in quietly, disguised as motivation, as awareness, as self-improvement. At first, it feels harmless. You look around. You notice where others are. You tell yourself you're just observing, just learning, just measuring what's possible. But slowly, almost invisibly, observation turns into judgment, and judgment turns inward. You start tracking your progress against someone else's timeline. You begin questioning your pace because it doesn't match theirs. You look at their achievements and wonder what you're missing. You look at their confidence and wonder why yours feels heavier. And the more you compare, the further you drift from your own sense of direction. Because comparison doesn't ask where you're going, it asks where you stand. And standing still inside someone else's story disconnects you from your own. The danger of comparison isn't that it shows you what others have, it's that it slowly convinces you that your way is wrong, that your rhythm is flawed, that your path should look different by now. And once that belief takes hold, you stop listening to your instincts, you stop trusting your timing, you stop respecting the process that shaped you into who you are. Comparison replaces curiosity with criticism. Instead of asking what you need, you ask why you're behind. Instead of noticing how far you've come, you focus on how far you think you should be. And that shift is subtle but powerful because now your inner voice no longer supports you. It monitors you. It keeps score. It reminds you of every gap, every delay, every perceived failure. You begin to feel disconnected from yourself, not because you're lost, but because you're no longer allowed to be where you are. Comparison teaches you to see your life from the outside instead of living it from the inside. You start viewing yourself as a project that's falling behind schedule, a story that's missing key milestones, a version that needs improvement before it's worthy of pride. And in doing so, you lose touch with the part of you that simply wanted to live, to explore, to grow without constant evaluation. When you compare, you flatten your experience. You reduce complex lives into highlight moments. You forget that what you're seeing is edited, filtered, incomplete. You forget that every person you compare yourself to carries struggles you'll never fully see. And yet you hold your own unedited reality against their most polished moments and call it truth. That imbalance creates shame, not loud shame, quiet shame, the kind that whispers instead of screams, the kind that makes you hesitate before celebrating yourself, the kind that makes your accomplishments feel smaller the moment you notice someone else's success, the kind that makes you question whether you deserve rest because someone else seems to be doing more. Comparison slowly erodes self-trust. You stop believing your feelings are valid because someone else seems happier. You stop honoring your exhaustion because someone else appears stronger. You stop valuing your progress because someone else moved faster. And each time you dismiss yourself in favor of someone else's story, you disconnect a little more from your own. That disconnection shows up in subtle ways. You feel less present in your own life. Achievements don't land the way they used to. Goals feel heavier instead of exciting. Joy feels conditional. Satisfaction feels temporary. Because comparison doesn't let you stay with your own experience. It pulls your attention outward, away from what you're building, away from what you're learning, away from what you're becoming. Comparison turns growth into a race. And races don't care about understanding. They care about speed. They don't care about alignment. They care about position. And when you treat your life like a race, you stop noticing the landscape. You stop appreciating the lessons. You stop honoring the detours that taught you things you wouldn't have learned any other way. You weren't meant to arrive quickly. You were meant to arrive honestly. But comparison convinces you that honesty is too slow, that depth is inefficient, that taking your time is a flaw. And once you accept that lie, you start rushing yourself through experiences you needed to fully feel. You skip reflection, you skip rest, you skip integration. And without integration, growth becomes fragile. Comparison also isolates you. It makes other people feel like benchmarks instead of companions. It turns connection into competition. It makes you guarded instead of open. Because when you're constantly comparing, you're always defending your position. And it's hard to feel connected when you're busy protecting your worth. You start hiding your struggles because you don't want to appear behind. You stop sharing your excitement because you don't want to appear ahead. You shrink yourself in both directions, trying to stay invisible enough to avoid judgment, yet visible enough to feel relevant. That tension is exhausting. And exhaustion makes it even harder to stay connected to yourself. When you're tired, you're more likely to believe the stories comparison tells you, that you're late, that you're lacking, that you missed something everyone else figured out. And those stories become louder the more disconnected you feel from your own values and priorities. Comparison blurs what matters to you. You start chasing goals that don't resonate. You adopt standards that don't fit. You measure success in ways that don't reflect your truth. And when you achieve those borrowed goals, the satisfaction feels hollow because deep down you know you weren't moving toward yourself. You were moving away from discomfort. The irony is that comparison promises clarity, but delivers confusion. It tells you where you stand, but not who you are. It gives you numbers, but not meaning. It gives you context, but not direction. And without action, progress feels empty no matter how impressive it looks. Reconnecting with yourself means stepping out of comparison. It means returning to your own internal compass, asking what feels right, not what looks right, honoring your pace, not someone else's timeline, valuing depth over speed, alignment over approval, growth over appearance. This isn't easy because comparison is everywhere. It's built into systems, platforms, conversations. It's normalized, encouraged, rewarded. But just because it's common doesn't mean it's healthy. And just because others participate doesn't mean you're allowed to step back. You're allowed to unfollow what makes you feel small. You're allowed to disengage from metrics that drain your joy. You're allowed to protect your focus because focus is fragile and comparison shatters it. When you stop comparing, you start listening again. You notice what energizes you. You notice what drains you. You notice what feels aligned and what feels forced. You start making choices based on resonance instead of recognition. And slowly, the connection to yourself begins to repair. You feel more present, more grounded, more patient. You stop rushing your story because you understand that your story is not late. It's unfolding. And unfolding can't be rushed without losing its meaning. Comparison disconnects you from yourself because it asks you to live in someone else's reflection. Reconnection happens when you turn inward and allow your life to be measured by integrity instead of imitation. You don't need to be ahead. You need to be aligned. You don't need to be faster. You need to be honest. You don't need to match anyone else's life. You need to live your own fully, attentively, without constantly stepping outside of it to check how it looks from a distance. The moment you stop comparing is the moment you start inhabiting your life again, fully, deeply, without translation, without justification, without the quiet erosion of self-trust that comes from measuring your worth against incomplete stories and borrowed standards. And as you reconnect with yourself, you begin to remember things comparison made you forget. Your resilience, your adaptability, your capacity to learn, your ability to start again. You remember that your path was never meant to mirror anyone else's. It was meant to teach you something only you could learn by walking it the way you are walking it. The disconnection fades slowly, not all at once. In moments where you choose presence over performance, in decisions where you choose alignment over approval, in pauses where you choose rest over rushing, and each of those moments brings you closer to yourself again, not as an idea, not as a comparison, not as a statistic, but as a living, evolving person whose worth does not depend on position, timing, or how your life looks next to someone else's, whose value has never been determined by where you stand in relation to others, but by how honestly you stand within your own experience, listening, learning, becoming, without needing to measure your life against anyone else's reflection. At some point, you realize that most of the world interacts with you through labels, titles, roles, numbers, expectations. They ask what you do before they ask who you are. They measure your value by productivity, visibility, results. They reduce your complexity into something easier to understand, easier to place, easier to judge. And without noticing when it started, you begin doing the same thing to yourself. You introduce yourself through achievements instead of values. You describe your life through milestones instead of meaning. You count years, followers, income, progress, mistakes. You turn your existence into something quantifiable because that's what the world responds to. That's what gets acknowledged. That's what gets rewarded. And slowly your identity shifts from something lived to something managed. Numbers feel objective. Labels feel stable. Expectations feel like direction. But none of them know you. A number can tell how much, but not how deeply. A label can describe a role, but not a soul. An expectation can point toward a standard, but not toward truth. And when you build your identity around these things, you begin living outside yourself. You start performing your life instead of inhabiting it. You become careful, calculated, strategic. You choose actions based on how they'll be perceived instead of how they'll feel. You ask whether something will add value instead of whether it will bring peace. You start editing your instincts because they don't always align with what's expected of you. Expectations are heavy because they pretend to be neutral. They come disguised as advice, as concern, as motivation. People tell you what you should want, where you should be by now, how your life should look at your age and your position with your potential. And because those expectations are so common, you assume they must be right. You internalize them, you carry them, you measure yourself against them. But expectations don't come from knowing you. They come from patterns, from averages, from assumptions, from what worked for someone else. And when you try to live up to expectations that were never designed for your life, you feel like you're constantly failing at a test you didn't sign up for. Reclaiming your identity begins with noticing where you've outsourced it, where you've allowed numbers to tell you your worth, where you've allowed labels to limit your range, where you've allowed expectations to silence your intuition. These things don't strip your identity all at once. They erode it slowly, day by day, choice by choice, until one day you look at your life and feel disconnected from it. Even if everything looks right from the outside, you can meet every expectation and still feel empty, because fulfillment doesn't come from alignment with standards. It comes from alignment with self. And self can't be measured. It can't be ranked. It can't be reduced into a category. It has to be felt, lived, questioned, returned to again and again. Letting go of labels can feel frightening because labels offer certainty. They tell you who you are supposed to be. They give you a script. And scripts are comforting when you're unsure. But scripts don't allow improvisation. They don't allow growth. They don't allow contradiction. And you are full of contradictions. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to outgrow versions of yourself that once felt right. You are allowed to disappoint expectations that no longer reflect who you are becoming. None of that makes you unstable. It makes you alive. Numbers tell you where you stand in relation to others. Identity asks where you stand with yourself, and standing with yourself requires honesty. It requires listening to discomfort instead of numbing it. It requires acknowledging when something looks successful but feels wrong. It requires courage to say this no longer fits even when it once defined you. The world will always prefer numbers because numbers are predictable. Identity is not. Identity shifts as you learn, as you experience loss, as you love, as you fail, as you begin again. And when you allow your identity to move with you instead of anchoring it to a past version, you create space for authenticity. You stop asking who you're supposed to be and start asking who you are. Right now, that question doesn't have a final answer, and that's not a weakness, that's freedom. Reclaiming your identity doesn't mean rejecting structure or responsibility. It means refusing to confuse structure with self. You can have goals without turning yourself into a metric. You can hold roles without letting them define your entire existence. You can meet expectations without surrendering your inner voice. The difference is awareness. When you're aware, you choose consciously instead of automatically. You pause before saying yes. You question before committing. You check in with yourself instead of defaulting to what's familiar or approved. And those pauses create space where identity can breathe. In that space, you begin to notice what actually matters to you, not what impresses others, not what looks good on paper, but what sustains you when no one is watching, what brings clarity instead of anxiety, what feels aligned instead of forced. Alignment doesn't always look successful. Sometimes it looks quiet. Sometimes it looks slow. Sometimes it looks like stepping away from things that gave you status but cost you peace. And that can feel like loss at first, because the world notices when you stop playing by its rules. But what you gain is harder to explain and impossible to fake. You gain ownership of your life. You stop introducing yourself through labels and start showing up as a presence. You stop counting your value and start experiencing it. You stop chasing validation and start cultivating integrity. And integrity is what remains when the numbers change, when the labels fall. When expectations shift as they always do, because they always do. What once defined you may not define you tomorrow. What once motivated you may no longer move you. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you grew, and growth requires release. Reclaiming your identity means allowing yourself to be in transition without rushing to define it, without forcing a conclusion, without demanding clarity before it arrives naturally. It means trusting that not knowing is part of knowing. You are not behind because you changed direction. You are not inconsistent because you evolved. You are not failing because you no longer fit a mold that was too small for you. The world will continue to offer labels. It will continue to ask for explanations. It will continue to measure. But you don't have to hand yourself over every time it asks. You can choose what you share. You can choose what you internalize. You can choose to live from the inside out instead of the outside in. Identity isn't something you announce, it's something you practice. In the way you speak to yourself, in the boundaries you set, in the values you protect when no one is rewarding you for it, in the choices you make when there's no audience. And those practices matter more than any label ever could. You don't need to prove who you are. You need to remember what feels true in your body. Remember what brings you back to yourself. Remember that you existed before expectations were placed on you, and you will continue to exist long after they change. Reclaiming your identity is not a single moment. It's a series of quiet decisions. To listen instead of perform, to feel instead of measure, to live instead of calculate. And each time you choose yourself in this way, something settles inside you, a sense of grounding, a sense of permission, a sense of being enough without needing to justify it. You are not your productivity, you are not your title, you are not your comparison, you are not the expectations projected onto you. You are the awareness behind all of it, the one who chooses, the one who reflects, the one who continues. And when you stop letting numbers tell your story, you begin telling it yourself, slowly, honestly, without needing it to fit into a category or make sense to everyone else. Because meaning doesn't require approval, it requires presence. The more you release the need to be defined, the more defined you become from within. Not fixed, not finished, but rooted, flexible, alive, moving with intention instead of pressure, standing with yourself instead of standing in line with expectations. And in that space, beyond labels, beyond numbers, beyond the constant demand to explain who you are, you begin to feel something steady and quiet and real, a sense of belonging that doesn't come from fitting in, but from finally standing in your own life without needing permission, without needing to be counted, without needing to be summarized, allowing your identity to unfold. It always was meant to, moment by moment, choice by choice, without a final definition waiting at the end.